It was the year 1879, and the rolling hills of rural Kentucky were bathed in the soft amber glow of late summer. The Whitfield estate, a sprawling cluster of timber and stone buildings, seemed tranquil from a distance, as if untouched by time. Yet inside its walls tension thrummed like a hidden pulse. Henry Whitfield, the patriarch, commanded the household with a rigidity that left no room for error. Every action was measured against his expectations, and every misstep, however minor, drew a rebuke sharp enough to echo in the hearts of those who lived under his roof. His sense of family honor was absolute. Disobedience was not merely frowned upon, it was considered a stain, one that could not be ignored or forgotten. Mary Whitfield, his 16-year-old daughter, felt the weight of these expectations from the moment she awoke each morning. Her chores were endless, her manners scrutinized, and even the softest misstep, an untied ribbon or a word spoken too, boldly risked punishment. Yet Mary was not a girl easily subdued. Inside her chest beat a restless fire, a longing that stretched beyond the estate walls. She yearned for a life untouched by her father's rules, for a world that allowed curiosity, freedom, and choice. That morning, Mary resolved to act on that restlessness. It began as something subtle, almost imperceptible. She lingered at breakfast, her spoon idly stirring the oatmeal, while Henry read aloud from the ledger, reciting debts, accounts, and obligations with the precision of a man obsessed. Henry's eyes flicked toward her once, sharp as a hawk, but Mary lowered her gaze and pretended to focus on her bowl. The defiance was slight, barely noticeable, yet it thrilled her. She felt a surge of power she had never experienced, a spark that whispered that perhaps she could carve a small space of her own within the suffocating rules of the household. Once breakfast concluded, Mary slipped quietly into the back study, a place where letters from neighbors and distant relatives were often left unattended. There she retrieved a folded note, the handwriting elegant and deliberate. The words spoke of town gossip, minor opportunities, and a hint of admiration that made her cheeks flush. Mary knew that if Henry discovered her correspondence, his anger would be swift and severe, but her curiosity overpowered caution. She read the letter slowly, savoring each line, feeling a thrill at holding a connection to the world outside the Whitfield estate. A sudden knock made her start. Thomas, her younger brother, peered around the doorway, eyes wide with worry. He was 14, but unusually perceptive for his age, already understanding the dangers of disobedience within their household. "Mary, father will be angry if he finds you hiding letters again," he whispered. Mary turned to him, a faint defiant smile playing on her lips. "I'm careful, Thomas. He never comes this way." Thomas shook his head, silently conceding the argument. He had long since learned that Mary's will was immovable, her impulses unpredictable. He stepped back and allowed her to read in peace, though worry lingered in his gaze. By mid-afternoon, Mary's determination had grown into a plan. A small village fair was taking place that day, a modest affair but lively, with merchants, musicians, and townsfolk gathering from miles around. Henry had expressly forbidden her to attend, insisting it was improper and unsafe, but Mary's yearning to see a world beyond the estate outweighed her fear. She dressed quietly, every motion careful, deliberate, her heart beating faster with each step toward the back gate. The soft wind carried laughter and music from the fair, teasing her senses and urging her onward. As she stepped onto the path leading down the hill, Henry's voice suddenly rang out, booming across the estate. "Mary, where do you think you are going?" Her heart leapt. For a brief moment she froze, caught between obedience and the intoxicating desire for freedom. Henry's gaze, sharp and unwavering, could cut through any excuse. Defiance, she knew, came at a high cost. Mary made her choice. She darted along the narrow path, skirts snagging on brambles, Thomas following silently behind, unsure whether to intervene or let events play out. The air smelled of summer grass, of earth and dust, carrying the distant strains of music from the village fair. The sounds of the world beyond her father's control were intoxicating, thrilling. Yet beneath that excitement, a seed of dread gnawed at her. By the time Mary reached the outskirts of the village, the fair spread before her like a living painting. Children laughed as they ran through the narrow streets. Merchants shouted their wares, and the faint sound of a fiddle carried over the cobblestones. For a moment, Mary allowed herself to breathe freely, Forgetting the rules and the watchful eye of her father, she felt alive, untethered, if only briefly. She wandered through the stalls, touching bolts of cloth, listening to vendors, letting the colors and scents of the fair wash over her. The world beyond the estate was vast and vibrant, and for the first time, she imagined a life where she could make her own choices, free of scrutiny. The thought was intoxicating. She didn't notice how others might be observing her, or the subtle whispers of the townsfolk who had seen her slip away from home. As she explored, a pang of unease tugged at her chest. She thought of Henry's temper, the strict lines of his face, the weight of his authority. What if her small rebellion led to consequences she could not escape? Yet she pushed the thought aside, telling herself she was careful, clever enough to avoid detection. Meanwhile, Thomas remained on the outskirts, keeping a watchful eye. He understood Mary better than anyone else, but he feared the day when her impulses would bring disaster. He wanted to intervene, to drag her back, but he hesitated. He knew that any confrontation in the open might only worsen the situation. Instead, he stayed back, silently hoping that his sister's instincts would carry her safely. Through the afternoon, Mary's mind wandered as she moved deeper into the fair. She saw a group of young men tossing coins at a ring, laughter ringing through the air. She imagined joining them, speaking freely without the constraints of the estate. Each passing moment heightened her sense of exhilaration, yet also reminded her of the invisible walls she had crossed. The thrill of independence, however, came with the shadow of reckoning, though she could not see it yet. Time passed unnoticed as she drifted through the fair. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the village square. Mary's joy was tempered by a growing awareness that she was far from home and her father's eyes could find her at any moment. Her pulse quickened, not just from excitement, but from the knowledge that her actions were not without risk. She paused at a stall selling trinkets, momentarily captivated by a small carved bird. She ran her fingers over its smooth surface, imagining a life where she could choose, where each small delight could belong to her alone. But the thought of Henry's disapproval lingered, a shadow at the edge of her consciousness. She was not blind to the danger, only willing for now to ignore it. As the day waned, Mary felt the first true pangs of anxiety. The fair's laughter, once sweet, now carried an edge of tension. She realized she had stepped into a world where consequences were real and unavoidable, a world where one impulsive choice could ripple outward, touching every part of her life. The thrill of rebellion clashed with a nascent dread that she could not shake. And then she sensed it, subtle glances, the quiet shifting of people nearby, the faint sound of footsteps not her own. She had believed she had escaped unnoticed, but the threads of her disobedience were already weaving a pattern she could not yet comprehend. Her father's influence extended further than she had imagined, and the consequences of today's rebellion were only beginning to take shape. Mary took a deep breath and moved through the crowd, trying to ignore the tension coiling in her chest. The fair continued around her, oblivious to her internal struggle, but Mary could not forget the weight of what she had done. A single day of defiance had already altered her place in the world, and she sensed, without fully understanding how, that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The day's events seemed to stretch endlessly, each moment carrying the thrill of freedom, alongside the shadow of impending consequences. Mary had believed that slipping away to the fair would grant her a taste of life beyond her father's control. In truth, it had only begun a chain of choices and reactions that would leave their mark on the Whitfield family forever. She moved through the crowd, unaware of the watching eyes, Henry's sharp, assessing gaze, Thomas's anxious concern, and the quiet observations of townsfolk, and for the first time, felt the weight of regret hovering at the edges of her exhilaration. Mary lingered at the fair longer than she had intended, moving from stall to stall with a restless curiosity. The music of fiddles and drums drifted in the warm afternoon air, carrying laughter and shouts from children who darted through the crowd. Each step deeper into the village filled her with a sense of freedom, yet a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. She had slipped past her father's gaze, but the world outside the estate was not without eyes of its own. A merchant near a fruit stand caught her attention, a man with a broad-brimmed hat and a roughened face, calling out the price of apples with a loud voice. Mary paused to watch him, brushing a strand of hair from her face. As she reached for a bright red apple, she noticed a few townsfolk glancing her way, murmuring among themselves. She felt a sudden stab of self-consciousness. Even in this vibrant crowd, her presence was not unnoticed. The knowledge that she had disobeyed her father carried weight, and now the whispers of neighbors seemed sharper, more critical. Thomas remained close, careful to keep a respectful distance. He watched Mary with apprehension, noting her growing confidence, but also sensing the early tremors of consequences. "Mary," he said softly, "perhaps we should leave soon. The longer we stay, the more attention you draw." Mary shook her head, a defiant glint in her eye. "I need to see this, Thomas. I can't go back just yet. Don't you want to know what lies beyond those gates?" Thomas exhaled slowly, knowing there was no reasoning with her at this moment. Her mind was made, and her desire to step into a world beyond the estate was too strong to suppress. Yet he worried deeply for the inevitable clash with their father. Hours passed and the fair began to wind down. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cobblestone paths. Mary's excitement remained, but an unease began to creep in. She noticed a small group of women, neighbors from nearby farms, casting sidelong glances her way, whispering quietly to each other. One of them, a matronly woman with sharp eyes, shook her head subtly in disapproval. Mary's pulse quickened. The whispers and glances carried a silent judgment, a reminder that her actions were already attracting scrutiny. As they made their way toward the outskirts of the village, Mary's mind wandered to the events at the estate that morning. She remembered the ledger, her father's sharp glance, and the letters she had hidden. The thrill of defiance was still there, but beneath it now stirred a cautious awareness. One misstep could unravel everything: her reputation, her place in the family, and perhaps the fragile trust Thomas still held in her judgment. Returning home, the estate seemed quieter than usual. The sun had set behind the hills, leaving the house in a muted shadow. Mary felt a pang of anxiety as she approached the back gate, imagining her father discovering her absence. She tried to slip quietly inside, but a floorboard creaked under her foot. The sound, small as it was, seemed deafening in the stillness of the evening. Henry was in the main hall when they entered, seated at a large wooden table with the ledger before him. His eyes lifted slowly, settling on Mary with a weight that made her stomach clench. There was no immediate outburst, only a tense silence that stretched uncomfortably. Mary's defiance from earlier now seemed trivial in comparison to the storm that might follow. "Where have you been?" Henry asked at last, his voice calm but cold, the kind that carried authority sharper than anger. Mary hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, but Thomas interjected softly. "She went to the fair, father. I accompanied her." Henry's eyes narrowed. "To the fair?" His voice rose slightly, the controlled anger of a man who believed rules were sacred. "Do you understand what such behavior implies? Do you think your whims justify disrespect toward this household?" Mary swallowed, her defiance warring with a sudden fear. I just wanted to see the village, father. I meant no harm." Henry's gaze hardened, and the room seemed to shrink around her. "Intentions matter little, Mary. The consequences of disobedience are not determined by your heart, but by the world's judgment, and by mine." He gestured to a chair near the table. "Sit, we will discuss this." Mary obeyed reluctantly, Thomas close by but silent. The tension in the room was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on every word and movement. Henry continued, his tone measured, but every syllable carried authority. "Your actions today have drawn attention. Neighbors have noticed your absence, and the whispers of gossip will reach far beyond these walls. Do you understand the risk you have taken?" Mary nodded, feeling a tightening in her chest. She had understood the risk, but experiencing it now, face to face with her father's disapproval, was far more severe than she had imagined. Regret stirred at the edges of her excitement, a quiet seed taking root. Henry's lecture continued, each word methodically shaping a lesson in obedience. He reminded her of the family's position, of their responsibility to maintain honor, and of the dangers of defiance. Mary felt the weight of each statement, understanding for the first Time that her small rebellion had consequences, far beyond her immediate pleasure. Later that evening, Mary retreated to her room. The dim candlelight cast long shadows across the walls, echoing the shadows that now seemed to stretch over her own choices. Thomas knocked softly before entering. "Are you all right?" he asked. Mary sank into a chair, her thoughts swirling. "I thought I could handle it," she murmured. "But I see now. Even small defiance carries a cost." Thomas nodded, his expression grave. "It's not just Father, Mary. The world is watching and it can be unforgiving. You must tread carefully." Mary reflected on the day's events. The freedom she had, tasted at the fair, now mingled with the stark reality of her father's authority. The thrill of independence was no longer simple pleasure. It had become a cautionary lesson, a reminder that every choice had weight. The first seeds of regret had taken hold, quiet but persistent, whispering warnings she could not ignore. As night deepened over the estate, Mary lay awake, thinking of the village, the fair, the consequences she had already faced. She realized that her defiance, small though it might have seemed, had already begun to ripple outward. The balance between her desires and her responsibilities was fragile, and she understood with a dawning clarity that the path she had taken was fraught with peril. And so the day ended with Mary caught between two worlds, the exhilarating taste of freedom and the heavy burden of consequence. She had learned that actions, however small, were never without impact, and that the shadow of her choices stretched far beyond what she had imagined. A quiet tension settled over the Whitfield estate, one that would deepen in the days to come, shaping the course of her life in ways she could not yet foresee. The morning after the fair dawned grey and heavy, the kind of light that seemed to press down on the estate. Mary awoke with a lingering sense of unease. The events of the previous day had settled into her mind like stones in her chest. She tried to distract herself with chores, sweeping the kitchen floors, polishing the wooden railings of the estate's hallways, yet every movement carried the weight of yesterday's defiance. Even the familiar rhythms of daily life felt alien, tainted by the knowledge that she had stepped beyond the boundaries set by her father. Henry had not spoken harshly after the lecture the evening before, but the silence had its own force. Each footstep in the hall, each shadow that moved across the rooms, seemed like a quiet judgment. Mary felt watched, not just by her father but by the household itself. Servants whispered among themselves, stealing glances, their words carrying hints of speculation and disapproval. She realized that in this small world, a single act of rebellion could spread like wildfire, leaving everyone complicit in witnessing the consequences. At breakfast, Henry's presence was a rigid, unyielding force. He ate slowly, deliberately, never raising his eyes until he addressed Mary. When he did, his words were measured but biting. "You understand the attention you drew yesterday, Mary," he said. "Do you think your whims are a shield against the consequences of your actions?" Mary looked down, her hands resting on the table. She wanted to speak, to explain herself, but a sudden tension in the room stopped her. Her father's gaze pierced her like steel. Thomas, sitting beside her, avoided her eyes, his worry palpable. He knew as well as she did that any misstep now could be costly. Henry's voice hardened. "Your behavior undermines the household. It sets a dangerous example for Thomas, and for any who might look to the Whitfield estate for guidance. Do you comprehend the seriousness of your conduct?" Mary nodded quietly, feeling a flicker of fear she had not expected. She had thought yesterday's actions were small, almost harmless. Now, faced with her father's authority in the open light of morning, she realized just how foolish that belief had been. The consequences were not a distant threat, they were here, tangible and immediate. After breakfast, Henry called her into the study. The room smelled faintly of leather and dust, the air heavy with the weight of family history. The ledger lay open, its pages a reminder of order and authority. Henry motioned for Mary to sit. "You have challenged my authority once," he said. "Tomorrow, you will face the discipline necessary to understand the weight of disobedience." Mary felt a chill. She had expected admonishment, perhaps a sharp lecture, but the gravity of the word discipline sent a tremor through her. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Thomas lingered near the doorway, silent, sensing the tension but unable to intervene. Mary spent the rest of the day in quiet preparation, attempting to fulfill her chores with precision, as if demonstrating her obedience could somehow lessen the punishment to come. She washed floors until her hands ached, polished furniture until it gleamed, yet each effort felt hollow. She could not erase the fact that she had acted against her father, and the inevitability of tomorrow's reckoning hung over her like a storm cloud. When night fell, the estate seemed to exhale a heavy, oppressive air. Mary lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining what form the punishment would take. She feared it might be corporal, a physical reminder of her failure to obey. She feared it might be a deeper humiliation, a cruel reminder of her place within the rigid structure of her father's household. Each possibility weighed upon her, and a growing sense of regret began to take root. For the first time, she understood that rebellion, however small, carried costs she had not fully anticipated. The next morning, Henry called Mary to the main hall. The servants watched in silence, their expressions carefully neutral, yet Mary could feel the tension radiating through the room. Henry's voice was calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Mary," he began, "today you will learn the consequences of actions taken without regard for duty or decorum." He produced a small cane, simple and unadorned, yet the sight of it made Mary's stomach tighten. She had never been subjected to physical discipline, but the gravity of the moment left no doubt in her mind. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation. Thomas's hand rested on hers briefly, a silent gesture of concern and solidarity. But he said nothing. The punishment was administered with deliberate care, each strike a calculated measure of authority, rather than cruelty for its own sake. Mary felt each one, a sharp reminder of the cost of defiance. Yet her father's gaze remained steady, impassive, as though measuring not only her physical response, but the lessons being absorbed by her mind. Each lash of the cane burned, and Mary's earlier sense of exhilaration at the fair seemed almost laughably distant. She realized in those moments that freedom came with a price, and that the exhilaration of defiance could quickly be replaced by shame and regret. When the punishment concluded, Mary was left in quiet reflection. The physical pain was brief, but the weight of the lesson lingered. She understood now that her actions had consequences far beyond what she had imagined. Her father's methodical enforcement of order had left an indelible mark, one that extended beyond the immediate punishment to a deeper understanding of her place within the household. The day continued with the usual household routines, yet the atmosphere had shifted. Mary moved with a subdued caution, aware of the eyes upon her. The servants, once casual in their interactions, now watched her closely, their behavior a subtle reflection of her father's control. Thomas remained quietly supportive, yet even he seemed burdened by the tension that now hung over the estate. As evening approached, Mary withdrew to her room once more. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. She reflected on the events of the day, the taste of freedom at the fair, and the sharp reality of her father's discipline. The thrill of independence now mingled with a keen awareness of her limitations, and a sense of regret settled heavily upon her. She understood that her choices had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment, and that the balance between desire and duty was delicate indeed. Mary's thoughts turned to the coming days, to the subtle ways in which her father's authority would continue to shape her actions and decisions. She realized that her life within the Whitfield estate was not hers alone to command, and that every act of rebellion would carry repercussions, seen and unseen. The awareness of this balance between freedom and consequence began to shape her thinking, planting the seeds of careful calculation alongside her innate restlessness. The night deepened, and the estate settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that spoke of generations of order and expectation. Mary lay awake, considering the lessons of the day, the sting of the cane, the weight of her father's gaze, and the subtle, unspoken judgments of the household. She understood that her life was a series of choices constrained by authority and expectation, and that each choice carried its own measure of consequence and regret. And yet, even in the face of discipline and the growing awareness of consequence, a spark of defiance remained, faint but persistent, within Mary. She recognized that the path forward would require careful navigation, but the desire to explore, to assert herself in small ways, had not been extinguished. The balance between rebellion and obedience, thrill and consequence would define the days to come, shaping not only Mary's experience but the dynamics of the Whitfield household in ways she could not yet foresee. The evening ended quietly, the estate enveloped in shadow and the stillness of history pressing down. Mary understood, more fully than ever, that her actions carried weight beyond her immediate understanding, and that the lessons of today were only the beginning of a longer, more complex journey of consequence, cruelty, and regret. The morning after her punishment, Mary moved cautiously through the Whitfield estate. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of the river and the surrounding hills, yet the serenity of the countryside contrasted sharply with the tension within the house. Henry walked through the halls with measured steps, each one echoing authority, and Mary felt the invisible weight of his judgment pressing down on her. Even Thomas, usually a comforting presence, seemed tense, his eyes darting toward their father with a quiet anxiety. Mary's thoughts were restless, replaying the events of the fair and the punishment that followed. Each memory brought a mixture of fear, regret, and a lingering curiosity. She knew her actions had consequences, yet a part of her still longed to assert herself, to carve a place where her voice mattered. She moved to the kitchen to help the cook prepare the day's bread, trying to occupy her mind with the mundane, but even the simple act of kneading dough could not distract her from the quiet tension in the household. Outside the estate, the village was abuzz with gossip. Word of Mary's absence and her father's stern discipline had spread quickly. Neighbors whispered as they passed the Whitfield property, their words carrying both judgment and curiosity. Mary's small act of rebellion had not gone unnoticed, and the social scrutiny added a new layer of pressure. She realized that her choices had repercussions beyond the walls of her home, and the realization brought both embarrassment and unease. Henry remained vigilant, observing not only Mary but the household itself. He understood that rebellion, even in small doses, could ripple outward, affecting the behavior of those around him. Servants moved with greater care, aware that the balance of authority was delicate, and even minor deviations could invite harsh consequences. Mary sensed the shift, noting the careful glances of those who once had spoken freely. The weight of observation pressed on her, and a quiet fear took root, alongside the lingering curiosity that still burned within her. By mid-afternoon, Mary was summoned to the parlor. The room smelled of polished wood and fading sunlight, the kind of calm that masked an undercurrent of tension. Henry seated himself, his posture rigid, and gestured for her to sit across from him. "Mary," he began, his voice calm but edged with severity, "your actions have not gone unnoticed beyond this estate. There are neighbors who speak of your disobedience. They question the management of this household and, by extension, our family's reputation." Mary's chest tightened. She had anticipated punishment within the house, but the knowledge that her choices affected the community added a new, heavier dimension. I did not intend for anyone to know, Father," she whispered, feeling the sting of her previous thrill, now replaced with apprehension. Henry's gaze was unwavering. "Intentions are irrelevant in the eyes of the world, Mary. It is the perception of your actions that matters, and perception shapes consequence. You must understand that every decision, however small, reverberates beyond this room." The weight of his words settled heavily on Mary. She had believed her rebellion, confined to the estate, a small act of independence, but now she realized that her world was far more interconnected than she had imagined. Her desire for freedom, however innocent in her mind, had already begun to disturb the delicate balance of social expectation. Thomas stood nearby, silent but vigilant, sensing Mary's growing discomfort. He understood that the lessons of today were not merely about obedience, but about navigating the complex web of authority and perception that defined their lives. Mary looked at him, grateful for his quiet support, yet aware that even he could not shield her from the broader consequences. As the day progressed, Mary attempted to resume her chores with diligence, hoping to demonstrate renewed compliance. She swept the floors, polished the silverware, and tended to the garden, yet a subtle unease followed her, Every movement felt watched, every word measured. The house, once a place of routine comfort, had become a stage upon which her actions were scrutinized. Even the servants who had once treated her with casual familiarity now approached with careful deference. Mary noticed the change and felt a pang of isolation. Her rebellion, though small and impulsive, had altered the dynamics of the household. Authority, she realized, was not merely enforced by one person, but supported by a network of observation and subtle compliance. Each act of defiance threatened to unsettle that balance. By evening, Mary was permitted a brief reprieve to walk along the estate's perimeter. The fading sunlight painted the hills in soft amber, and for a moment, the world beyond the estate seemed peaceful, untouched by the tension she carried within. She wandered toward a small grove near the river, the sound of water rushing over stones providing a faint sense of solace. Yet even in this moment of calm, a subtle anxiety lingered. She imagined neighbors discussing her absence, speculating about her behavior, and wondered how much Henry had shared with them. The thought that her actions might have caused gossip and judgment beyond the estate brought a new kind of regret. It was no longer about, immediate punishment, but about the lasting impression of her choices in the eyes of others. As Mary sat beneath a tall oak, Thomas approached quietly, his presence a steadying influence. "You must be careful," he said, his voice low. "Even small actions can carry weight you do not yet see. The world outside is unforgiving, and Father's discipline is only part of it." Mary nodded, understanding the gravity in his words. She had tasted freedom and faced consequences, and the balance between desire and duty had never felt more precarious. The grove, once a place of escape, now seemed a reminder of the narrow margin within which she could move. Returning to the estate, Mary found the household quieter than usual. Henry had retired to his study, leaving a lingering presence that was felt in every shadow and corner. The servants moved with subdued care, their expressions carefully neutral, reflecting the unspoken tension that had settled over the house. Mary moved through the halls with measured steps, aware of the watchful eyes that followed her progress. That night, as candlelight flickered across the walls of her room, Mary reflected on the day, the excitement of the fair, the thrill of defiance, and the sharp sting of discipline had all left their mark. Yet now a deeper understanding had taken root. The world was complex, authority was multifaceted, and every choice had consequences beyond the immediate moment. The lessons were subtle but clear, and a quiet seed of caution began to grow alongside her enduring curiosity. Mary realized that her journey was only beginning. The Whitfield estate, with its rigid rules and watchful authority, had shown her the cost of rebellion. Yet the spark within her, the desire to explore, to understand, to assert herself, remained. It was a delicate balance between daring and discretion, freedom and consequence, and Mary understood that the coming days would require careful navigation. Outside the window, the moon rose over the hills, casting a silver light across the fields and forests. Mary's thoughts turned to the broader world beyond the estate, a place she longed to explore yet feared in equal measure. The tension between desire and caution, thrill and regret, had become a constant presence in her life. She knew that each decision she made would carry repercussions, shaping not only her own experience, but the lives of those around her. As she lay in bed, Thomas quietly seated himself nearby, offering silent comfort. The household was asleep, yet the air remained heavy with unspoken thoughts and unseen consequences. Mary understood that her story, her choices, and her defiance were no longer contained within the walls of the estate. They had begun to ripple outward, touching the broader world in ways she could not yet predict. The night deepened, and Mary's eyes remained open, thinking of the days to come. She realized that authority, social expectation, and family dynamics were forces that would shape her every step. Yet even amidst the weight of consequence and the early seeds of regret, a quiet spark of rebellion lingered, reminding her that the desire to explore, to assert herself, and to understand the world beyond the estate could not be fully extinguished. The day had taught her that every action had a ripple, every choice a consequence, and every act of defiance a price. The Whitfield estate, with its walls, rules, and watchful eyes, would continue to challenge her. Yet Mary understood more fully than ever that her journey was far from over. The subtle pressures of society, family, and authority would shape her path, and the lessons she learned now would echo through her life, leaving traces of caution, curiosity, and the quiet, enduring spark of rebellion. The dawn of the 5th day, after the fair, brought with it a fragile stillness over the Whitfield estate, a calm that was deceptive in its quiet. Mary awoke with a heaviness in her chest, the memory of the punishment and the subtle social repercussions from the village pressing on her mind. She dressed slowly, each movement deliberate, trying to avoid drawing attention, yet she felt as though the walls themselves were watching. The previous days had taught her that even small gestures carried weight, and the household now seemed to hum with an awareness of her actions. Henry, as always, was awake early, moving through the estate with the precise rhythm of authority. His presence dominated every corner, a silent assertion of control. Mary watched him from the doorway of her room, noting the rigid set of his shoulders, the careful measurement of his steps, and the unwavering gaze that seemed to see beyond appearances. His watchfulness was no longer merely parental concern. It had become a method of control, a constant reminder that every act, every thought could have consequences. Mary tried to occupy herself with her chores, sweeping the floors, tending the garden, and assisting the cook with preparations for the day. Yet every movement felt scrutinized, every sound amplified. The servants, already cautious after the events of the fair, now carried an air of tension, their eyes occasionally flicking toward Mary with suspicion or perhaps disapproval. She realized that rebellion was not only punished by authority, but also by the subtle judgments of those around her, a network of observation that reinforced the weight of consequence. Thomas remained near, silent but attentive, sensing both Mary's unease and the growing complexity of the household's dynamics. He understood that the lessons she was learning were not merely about obedience, but about navigating the intricate balance of authority, perception, and social expectation. Mary glanced at him, a mixture of gratitude and apprehension in her eyes. She knew he could not shield her from everything, yet his presence provided a faint reassurance in a household that now felt increasingly isolating. Mid-morning brought an unexpected visitor, a distant cousin, Edward Whitfield, who had come from a neighboring county. He was a young man of 22, sharp-eyed and quick to speak, with a subtle arrogance that suggested he considered himself more worldly than the rest of the family. Henry welcomed him formally, yet Mary sensed a tension beneath the cordiality. Edward's gaze lingered on her longer than propriety would suggest, a mixture of curiosity and judgment that made her uneasy. Edward had heard whispers of Mary's absence at the fair and her subsequent punishment. While he spoke politely, Mary could detect the underlying amusement in his tone, a subtle satisfaction at the disruption in the household. He asked about the estate, the crops, and the local happenings, but his questions always circled back, indirectly, to Mary's actions. She felt a quiet irritation, a sense that her choices were now being measured by yet another set of eyes, and that her rebellion, once private and thrilling, had become fodder for judgment and comparison. Henry, aware of the scrutiny, maintained a careful balance. He answered Edward's questions with precision, emphasizing the propriety of the estate and the importance of family honor. Yet the undercurrent of tension was undeniable. Mary sensed that her father's authority was not absolute. In the presence of outsiders, it required reinforcement through observation, control, and the subtle assertion of consequence. Edward, for his part, seemed to relish the opportunity to observe, perhaps even to exploit, the fragile dynamics that had begun to emerge. As the day progressed, Mary attempted to maintain composure, fulfilling her tasks with diligence, yet a sense of unease grew within her, a realization that her actions had consequences beyond immediate punishment. Edward's presence, the subtle gossip of the servants, and the lingering judgment of her father created a network of tension that pressed upon her from all sides. Even Thomas, usually a source of comfort, could not alleviate the sense of scrutiny that seemed to follow her every step. By late afternoon, the household gathered in the main hall for a formal discussion of estate matters. The air was thick with anticipation, and Mary could sense the underlying currents of judgment and expectation. Edward, seated across from her, observed her with a quiet intensity, his gaze both probing and critical. Henry spoke of responsibilities, propriety, and the importance of maintaining the family's reputation, each word reinforcing the weight of duty and authority. Mary listened, absorbing the lessons, yet a restlessness stirred within her. She longed to assert herself, to move beyond the constraints imposed by authority and expectation, yet each impulse was tempered by the memory of recent punishment and the subtle social consequences she had begun to experience. The balance between desire and discretion, thrill and consequence had never felt more delicate. Edward's presence added an unexpected layer to the tension. He questioned decisions, suggested minor changes to routines, and occasionally offered pointed observations about the household's management. While his words were framed politely, Mary recognized the subtle undermining inherent in his tone. It was a quiet form of betrayal, a demonstration of how external influence could magnify the impact of her earlier defiance. She realized with a mixture of frustration and unease that rebellion had consequences, not only in immediate authority but also in the perceptions and actions of others, who were now watching closely. As evening approached, Henry retired to his study, leaving the household in a quieter yet still tense state. Mary moved to her room, reflecting on the day's events. The presence of Edward, the subtle judgments of the servants, and the pervasive scrutiny from her father had created a complex web of consequence. She understood that her small act of defiance had initiated a chain of reactions that extended far beyond her immediate understanding. Thomas, noticing her contemplative state, approached quietly. "You have done nothing to invite true malice, Mary," he said, "but the world is harsh in its judgments. Even the smallest deviation from expectation can be magnified by those who watch." Mary nodded, understanding the weight in his words. Her mind wandered to the broader implications, how her rebellion had ripple effects beyond her knowledge, how the subtle betrayals of observation and judgment could shape outcomes, and how her choices now required careful consideration. The thrill of defiance was tempered by the realization that each act carried consequences, some immediate, some lingering, and some that would only become apparent over time. Night fell over the estate and Mary lay in her bed, contemplating the lessons of the day. She understood that authority was not simply enforced by force but by perception, influence, and subtle power. Edward's presence, while not overtly threatening, had introduced a layer of complexity that made the household feel smaller, more scrutinized and more fraught with potential conflict. Mary realized that rebellion, even when fueled by curiosity and desire, could invite both direct and indirect consequences, and that the network of observation she had awakened extended far beyond what she had imagined. In the quiet of her room, Mary felt a mix of emotions: regret for the choices that had led to her punishment, frustration at the constraints of authority, and a lingering spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. She understood more clearly than ever that the path ahead would require balance, strategy, and awareness. Each decision she made would resonate through the estate, influencing both immediate outcomes and long-term perceptions. And so, with Mary caught in a delicate tension, the interplay of rebellion, scrutiny, and subtle betrayal creating a web that would define her next steps. The spark of defiance remains, but it is tempered by the complex forces of authority, social expectation, and family dynamics. The estate awoke under a dull grey sky, the kind that cast long shadows over the fields and hills. Mary stirred reluctantly, the memory of Edward's subtle judgment and her father's quiet scrutiny weighing on her mind. She rose slowly, the ache in her limbs from earlier discipline still fresh, a tangible reminder of consequences she could not escape. Even the sunlight filtering through the windows seemed heavy, filtered through the lens of obligation and expectation. Henry had been awake long before her, moving through the estate with precise and deliberate steps. His presence had become an ever-present shadow, an invisible force that measured every gesture and word. Mary sensed his attention even when he was not near. Each footfall in the hall, each sound in the kitchen, seemed amplified under the weight of authority. Thomas followed her silently, his eyes reflecting a quiet concern, knowing the storm that was poised to descend, yet unable to prevent it. By mid-morning, the estate was unusually quiet. Servants moved with careful precision, whispering sparingly, their glances cautious and deliberate. Mary began her chores as usual, sweeping the floors and tending the garden. But an unease had settled over her that was heavier than ever before. She had already tasted the cost of rebellion. Now the stakes felt higher, the potential for cruelty sharper and closer. It was in the late morning that Henry summoned Mary to the study, the room smelling faintly of leather and old paper. The ledger lay open on the desk, and his presence carried a gravity that silenced even the soft sounds of the estate. "Mary," he began, his voice calm but edged, with an authority that made her stomach tighten. "Your recent behavior, while seemingly minor, has consequences that extend beyond our household. I have received word of further disturbances, an ill-chosen word here. A glance there, small lapses that you may not recognize as significant, but which have been observed." Mary's heart pounded. She had been careful, she thought, yet the knowledge that even minor slips were being scrutinized brought a new and sharp awareness. "Father," she said softly, "I've tried to—" "You have tried," Henry interrupted, his voice precise and cold. "But intentions do not erase outcomes. Every deviation, however small, carries weight. Today you will witness the full measure of consequence, not merely as a lesson, but as an example." Mary felt a chill spread through her. She had endured discipline before. Yes, but the implication that her actions now carried broader, moral and social consequences sent a shiver down her spine. The punishment she faced would not be merely physical or private. It would be a public assertion of order and consequence within the estate, witnessed in ways she could not avoid. Thomas remained silent at the doorway, a quiet witness to what he knew would unfold. He could offer no protection, only a sympathetic presence, as Mary was guided into the parlor, where several servants and even Edward had been quietly gathered. The room was heavy with anticipation, the quiet murmur of unseen observation pressing upon her. Henry addressed the household with a deliberate calm, explaining the nature of Mary's rebellion and the necessity of consequence. The servants, young and old, listened intently, and Mary could feel the weight of their scrutiny pressing upon her. The punishment that followed was methodical, each measure designed not for immediate cruelty alone, but to impress upon her the weight of action and responsibility. The cane returned, but this time the measure of its use was intertwined with public observation. Each strike was deliberate, calculated, a sharp punctuation that echoed across the parlor. Mary flinched, her breath catching with each contact. Yet the deeper impact came from the eyes that watched her, the servants, Edward and even Thomas, whose sorrowful gaze reflected the moral gravity of the moment. The lesson was no longer private. It had become a demonstration of authority, consequence, and social expectation. After the punishment, Mary sank into a chair, the sting of both body and mind pressing heavily upon her. She realized more acutely than ever that defiance carried consequences beyond immediate pain. The moral weight of rebellion, coupled with social observation and subtle judgment, created a crushing reality she could not ignore. Even her father's quiet demeanor now felt like a sharper blade, slicing through the remnants of her previous confidence. The remainder of the day passed in a haze of reflection, chore, and subdued conversation. Mary moved through the household with meticulous care, aware that every glance, every word, every small action would be noted. She understood now that her rebellion, however brief or minor it seemed, had ripples that extended far beyond her immediate perception. Authority, she realized, was reinforced not only through overt acts of discipline, but also through the silent judgments and moral assessments of those who observed her. In the evening, Mary withdrew to her room, the candlelight casting long shadows across the walls. She sat by the window, her thoughts drifting to the river, to the hills, and to the village she had glimpsed days ago. Freedom, she reflected, carried a cost, and the exhilaration she had once felt was now tempered by an acute awareness of consequence. The weight of observation, the subtle moral shocks inflicted by her father and by the household, and the early seeds of regret had all combined to shape a new understanding within her. Rebellion could not exist without consequence, and consequence was rarely confined to the moment it was incurred. Thomas approached quietly, offering his presence as a quiet anchor. "Mary," he said softly, "the lessons you have learned are harsh, but they are not without purpose. Authority, observation, and consequence are forces that shape life in ways we cannot always foresee. The world is unforgiving, yet understanding these truths allows us to navigate it more wisely." Mary nodded, feeling the gravity of his words. The spark of defiance still lingered within her, but it was tempered by a growing awareness of the moral and social dimensions of her actions. The thrill of rebellion had been replaced by a cautious calculation, a recognition that freedom carried costs that could be severe and far-reaching. The night deepened, and the estate settled into its usual rhythm of quiet and shadow. Mary lay in bed reflecting on the events of the day, the sting of punishment, the observation of the household, and the subtle moral shock delivered through both public and private scrutiny. She understood that the coming days would require not only obedience, but careful discernment, a balance between curiosity and discretion, desire and consequence. And yet, even amidst the weight of regret and the moral gravity imposed upon her, a quiet ember of rebellion persisted. Mary knew that her journey was far from complete, that the lessons of authority and consequence were only part of the story, and that the choices she would make in the days to come would define not only her own experience but the dynamics of the Whitfield household for years to follow. The evening closed with a sense of heavy stillness, a pause that suggested both reflection and anticipation. The moral shocks of the day had been deeply felt, the cruelty deliberate yet measured, and the lessons, though harsh, were indelibly etched into Mary's understanding. The balance between rebellion, observation, and consequence had never been more acute, and she knew that the final chapter of this unfolding tension was approaching, a Bisias chapter that would demand reckoning, resolution, and the ultimate measure of both cruelty and regret. The morning sun rose pale and grey over the Whitfield estate, casting long soft shadows across the frost-dusted gardens. Mary awoke slowly, the weight of the past week pressing on her chest. The cold air seeped through her window, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from the kitchen hearth and the earthy smell of the fields. Today felt heavier, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for the final reckoning of lessons learned, rebellions punished, and consequences absorbed. Henry was already moving through the halls, his steps measured and deliberate. Even the familiar rhythm of his authority seemed different today, less rigid, more observant, as though he, too, recognized the significance of this day. Thomas lingered quietly nearby, a steady presence that offered reassurance without interfering. Mary dressed carefully, each movement deliberate, aware that the household was watching, and that the culmination of all her choices would unfold before these very eyes. By mid-morning, the estate had settled into a tense quiet. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating the worn wooden floors and the heavy curtains in soft amber light. The family gathered in the main hall, the air thick with anticipation. Henry stood at the head, his posture commanding but tempered with an unmistakable gravity. "Mary," he said, his voice carrying evenly, "the lessons of the past days have been harsh, yet they are necessary. Actions, no matter how small, carry consequences that affect not only yourself, but all who dwell under this roof. Today we recognize the full measure of those lessons and seek understanding and reconciliation." Mary's chest tightened. Though she had endured discipline and scrutiny, hearing her father acknowledge the moral weight in this formal manner gave the moment an unfamiliar gravity. She glanced at Edward, who was seated across the room, his expression composed yet sharp. There was something different in his eyes. Today, a faint shadow of respect mingled with the judgment he had carried throughout the week. The servants, too, observed silently, their faces neutral but attentive, their prior whispers now replaced by a quiet sense of curiosity and expectation. Henry continued, "Authority is not exercised for cruelty alone. It is a tool to guide, to instruct, and to ensure that those within our care understand the consequences of choice. Mary has learned, as we all must, that freedom without foresight can lead to harm, and that even minor defiance can ripple outward in ways unforeseen." Edward spoke next, his voice calm but incisive. "I have witnessed the household these past days. What might appear as minor lapses in judgment have demonstrated the fragility of order and the weight of personal responsibility. Mary has endured consequences that extend beyond mere correction. She has learned the subtle, inescapable influence of observation, societal expectation, and the moral consequences of her choices." Mary absorbed his words, feeling both unease and understanding. Edward's acknowledgement carried a moral weight of its own. It was not outright approval, but recognition that she had survived, reflected, and begun to understand the complexities of human action. Thomas, ever silent yet steadfast, gave her a faint nod, reinforcing that she was not alone in this moment of reckoning. The late morning sun softened, turning the hall a warm honey gold as Henry addressed the servants. "Let these lessons serve all within this household," he said. "Observation, guidance, and consequence shape not only the young but all who serve, reminding us that order and respect are intertwined. Each action resonates and each choice carries weight." Mary felt a mixture of relief and lingering tension. The punishment and scrutiny had been rigorous, yet the acknowledgement of growth and understanding offered an emotional payoff. She realized that rebellion was not simply about defiance. It was about learning, reflection, and the consequences of choice. Edward's presence had heightened that understanding, and now his recognition made her feel that her journey had finally found its balance. By midday, a gentle breeze rustled the trees outside, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and the river beyond the estate. Mary walked to the grove near the water, the soft sunlight glinting off the rippling surface. Henry followed at a respectful distance, while Thomas remained close enough to offer comfort without interrupting her thoughts. Mary paused, reflecting on the events of the week, the thrill of defiance, the sting of discipline, the scrutiny of her family and household, and the subtle moral shocks that had reshaped her. Understanding of authority and consequence. Edward appeared quietly at the edge of the grove, his expression unreadable. "Mary," he said, "you have learned much, and though you have suffered, it is evident that your understanding has deepened. Rebellion carries consequences, yes, but the insight you now possess will guide you far beyond these walls." Mary's heart lifted slightly. For the first time, Edward's acknowledgement felt like a subtle form of redemption. Not all defiance is folly, she realized, and not all scrutiny is cruel. Some consequences exist to illuminate, not merely punish. Henry approached next, his voice gentle but firm. "Remember, Mary, that courage must always be tempered with foresight. Life outside this estate will present choices, challenges, and moments of temptation. The lessons of these days are not simply about obedience. They are about discernment, reflection, and responsibility." Mary nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. She understood now that wisdom is born from consequence, and that the sting of regret can guide future actions as effectively as instruction or authority. The spark of rebellion, though subdued, remained, a quiet ember ready to illuminate the path of careful, considered action. As afternoon faded to evening, the sun dipped low, painting the fields and river in shades of gold and crimson. Mary returned to the main hall, where the household moved with quiet diligence, their eyes occasionally meeting hers with respect rather than judgment. The balance of authority, observation, and understanding now felt fully established, and Mary sensed that the lessons of cruelty, regret, and consequence had reached their natural resolution. Thomas stayed near her side as they moved through the estate, and Mary felt a renewed sense of calm and clarity. The week had been a crucible, shaping not only her character, but the perception of those around her. Edward's subtle recognition, Henry's tempered guidance, and Thomas's unwavering support had combined to create an environment where learning, reflection, and moral insight coexisted with order and authority. Night fell over the estate, the moon casting a silver glow across the river and gardens. Mary settled into her room, the candlelight flickering softly across the walls. She reflected on rebellion and consequence, cruelty and insight, judgment and redemption. Each experience had left its mark, forging understanding and awareness that would guide her throughout life. Before sleep fully claimed her, Mary thought of the Whitfield estate, of Edward's judgment, Thomas's loyalty, and Henry's quiet authority. She recognized that life beyond the estate would present further challenges and moments where choice, defiance, and observation intersected. Yet the lessons learned this week had prepared her to navigate those moments with insight, caution, and tempered courage. The candle burned low, and Mary whispered quietly to herself, acknowledging both the weight of past mistakes and the promise of a future guided by reflection and understanding. The spark of rebellion remained, tempered but alive, a guiding ember for the days ahead. Thomas gave a quiet nod from the doorway. Henry's footsteps receded to his study, and Edward lingered briefly before departing with a subtle bow of acknowledgement. The household settled into quiet reflection, and Mary finally allowed herself to rest fully, the past week's trials resolved, her mind enriched by insight, and her heart tempered by the delicate balance of courage, consequence, and regret. And so the Whitfield estate, under the glow of the moon and stars, bore witness to the final lessons of rebellion, cruelty, moral reckoning, and reflection. Mary, now wiser, tempered, and aware of the consequences that accompany every choice, drifted into sleep, carrying with her the knowledge that life, with all its complexities, requires vigilance, insight, and the courage to act thoughtfully, even in the face of temptation, defiance, and the subtle moral tests of those around us.